Hi, and welcome to the At the Races webinar. I'm Herb Jackson, the politics editor of CQ Roll Call, and I'm here with reporters Stephanie Aiken and Bridget Bowman. Our elections analyst, Nathan L. Gonzalez, will join us in a little while after he gets his son down for a nap. So at this time next week, there will only be 5 states left to hold their primaries. So we've had a good chance to see how the party dynamics are playing out in the 2020 election at the state and district level. We've seen that picking nominees during the COVID-19 pandemic forced campaigns to change. Candidates like me had to learn how to Zoom and use other tools to communicate, not only with their staffs, but with contributors and with voters. The places where candidates normally do retail politics, the Chamber of Commerce lunches, the state fairs, the parades, the factory visits, they're all mostly locked down. Some of them are doing door-to-door canvassing or groups, but it's controversial. And the party conventions that start next week are basically TV shows. Almost no one is really convening. If it were normal times, we'd all be packing for Milwaukee right now. So that has meant that advertising, both on the web and TV, and digital strategies have become more important. Candidates had to build up email lists or buy email lists and then craft the right messages to get people to click that little contribute button on the bottom of the emails. And normally, incumbents don't have to worry about primaries unless redistricting throws a bunch of them together. But this year, we've already seen 3 Democrats and 4 Republicans lose primaries or party conventions, and there could be more to come. The last time there were this many in a non-redistricting year, it was 1974, and they were dealing with the repercussions of Watergate. Heading into 2020, House Republicans thought Democrats would be on defense this year because they thought Democrats won 30 seats in districts that President Donald Trump won in 2016. Trump's going to be on the ballot 2020. We should flip all those districts back, or at least a lot of them. But in his latest ratings, Nathan has many of those House freshmen in those Trump districts in the solid Democratic column. And he projects that House Democrats could easily see a net increase in seats. Senate control is also in play. So before I let Stephanie and Bridget give you some of the details on what they've seen, I just wanted to let you know that if you have questions, you can comment on whatever platform you're watching us on, whether it's Twitter or YouTube or Facebook or Instagram. And the helpful people who help us out with this stuff will forward those questions to me in this Zoom room. And then I also want to put in a pitch for At the Races, the email newsletter that all the cool kids got in their inboxes about a half hour ago. It runs down our coverage and what we've been reading from other news outlets and shares some regular features as well, including inviting you all to give us a suggestion of a race that you want to see us profile in the following week. If you're not getting it, just go to rollcall.com/newsletters and you can subscribe. Now let's get to it. Bridget, give us the big picture. With less than 3 months to go, how does the battle for the House and Senate look right now?
Sure. Well, Herb, you kind of touched on it. Democrats are feeling pretty good about things right now, pretty good about not just holding on to their House majority, but growing it and even maybe flipping the Senate. Just as a reminder for everybody watching, so Republicans need a net gain of 17 seats to flip the House. Democrats need a net gain of 3 or 4 seats to flip the Senate, depending on who wins the White House, because the vice president casts a tie-breaking vote in the Senate. And as we've been talking to campaign strategists, so last week we published our list of 10 most vulnerable incumbents in the House and the Senate. It gave us a chance to talk to a lot of folks from both parties. And across the board, we generally see the president's approval rating dropping in competitive states and competitive districts, which is a big problem for Republican congressional candidates. Democrats, as I said, are feeling pretty good. They've been fundraising a lot, some eye-popping numbers. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about our list, but that definitely gave us a good overview. It's always a big project for us, but just of where things are right now, and Republicans are in some trouble.
Yeah, sure. When we started out making this list at the beginning of the cycle, I think everybody's assumption was that Republicans who were in Trump districts would top the list. And that's the way it has been the first 2 times, the first time we published the list and the first time we revised it. But this time going back, we started to realize that even the Democrats, did I say Republicans last time? I meant, sorry, the Democrats in Trump districts would be at the top of the list. So when we came back to revise the list this cycle, when we started to look at the numbers and talk to people, we realized that even Democrats in some districts that everybody assumed would be the most vulnerable people in Congress at the beginning of this cycle were in actually a position where they could very well win their races. And the map wasn't looking so great for Republicans. So to reflect that, we have a Republican at the top of the list this time, and then 3 Democrats in Trump districts who still could surprise us. I mean, their races are actually looking pretty good. Also, the list is evenly split between Republicans and Democrats this time.
In the House, yes.
Yes. When we're looking at the Senate list, the list of competitive Senate races has stayed pretty much the same throughout the entire cycle. Who's most vulnerable, who's in the toughest races has not really changed. But in our most recent list, we did see Michigan Democrat Gary Peters drop off, Georgia Republican David Perdue come back on, which is another sign that the map kind of overall is shifting towards Democrats. But that is not to say that the battle of Congress is over and we can just all go home and we're done. There are going to be a lot of really competitive, expensive races in both the House and Senate that we're going to be watching really, really closely.
And where have you seen the race? What's been turning on the race? Is it different parts of the country, or is it the same? Is the same sort of dynamic playing out in almost every area?
Yeah, it's a few different things. Certainly the pandemic has really caused the president's approval rating to drop fairly significantly. He had already, as we saw in 2018, been really struggling in suburban areas. And that the pandemic and all the unrest and the racial reckoning as well has really just exacerbated that problem for Republicans. So among moderate and independent voters, still really struggling.
And that's something that we took into account when we were looking at our list this time around. Like in the House, for example, Kendra Horn, who everybody thought was going to be the most vulnerable member of Congress at the beginning of the cycle, because she's in a district where a Republican hasn't been the representative since in the last 40 years, and she won it by a very narrow margin. That's outside Oklahoma City, but now she's number 3 this time, right? Yeah. And that's partly because that district is more suburban, and we moved up Social Chores Small, who's in a very rural district in New Mexico, and we were looking at those dynamics there.
And I will say too, one of the interesting things about the primaries that now, as a lot of the primaries, as you mentioned, are over and we're looking at November fast approaching. One of the things that we've been hearing from campaign strategists during the primaries is that it's incredibly difficult to predict turnout. And there are a lot of people voting by mail for the first time that have never done so. And that was just, there's this kind of cloud of uncertainty over what the election is going to look like. And that was playing out in a number of primaries as well.
And we just had another dose of that today with the president talking about how voting by mail is part of his strategy in debating with the House on funding in the COVID bill and whether or not to provide relief for the postal service. So let's talk about the two parties. Looking at the Democrats, for example, how in the primaries, what did we see what stood out to you, Bridget?
Sure. So looking at kind of the House and the Senate, there are some different dynamics happening. In the battle for the Senate, Democrats are on offense, so they're recruiting challengers to take on these sitting Republican senators. And we actually saw the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, that's the campaign arm for Senate Democrats, be pretty aggressive about endorsing preferred candidates in some of these primaries. And overall, their candidates have succeeded. There was one surprise loss in Tennessee recently, but of the 15 candidates that they've endorsed before the primaries, 11 of them have won, which has been really interesting to kind of watch, because you might think having the national party stamp of approval could be a problem among liberal primary voters. But talking to some Democratic strategists about what was going on here, they mentioned there was sort of a similar dynamic playing out in Senate races that we saw in the presidential race, with a lot of voters asking, who is the best candidate that can win, and kind of having this sort of pragmatic mindset. That's not to say we didn't see close Senate Democratic primaries. Kentucky is definitely one that stands out for sure. But overall, it's been interesting to see the party be pretty, like I said, aggressive in playing in some of these races. And on the House side, as you mentioned, Herb, so 3 Democratic incumbents lost, which was pretty significant. 2 of them, Dan Lipinski and William Lacey Clay, lost to primary opponents that they actually faced in 2018 as well. So maybe proving to knock out an entrenched incumbent, you need a couple cycles under your belt to kind of build up name ID and fundraising. We also saw Elliot Engel from New York City lose in a primary, and Justice Democrats, which is a group that supported Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2018, has been saying this is a sign that we're here to stay and we're going to be a force in the party.
And then Stephanie, so how about Republicans? I imagine there's one word that matters more than any in Republican primaries.
Yeah, on the Republican side, we're seeing similar themes in the House and the Senate. As is expected generally in primaries, Republicans want to play to their base, but it has been surprising to us that given the president's poll numbers and the overall climate, that Republicans in primaries have still really stuck to that traditional Trump campaign, and those have been the candidates who have tended to win. And even in some districts that are pretty suburban, I mentioned Oklahoma's 5th district, where Kendra Horn is trying to keep her seat there. We saw 2 Republicans make it to a runoff, which is going to be on August 25th. One of them did this very traditional Trump-style campaign. The other one is a state lawmaker who does have kind of a moderate record, and she has kind of struggled to play up that moderate record, but also still appeal to the Trump base. Which is interesting. On the Senate side, we're seeing that too. In the Georgia Senate, one of the 2 Georgia Senate seats that's up this cycle, for example, we're seeing Kelly Loeffler, who is an appointed senator who has had the seat now for a while, up against Doug Collins, who was President Trump's choice for that seat. And they're even given the dynamics of Georgia as a battleground state, where minority voters and liberal voters or more moderate voters, or at least are starting to be much more important in that state. You're seeing the 2 of them really compete to see who could appeal the most to the Trump base, even though because of the weirdness of that particular election, all of the Republican and Democratic candidates are going to be on the same ballot in November. So that's been really interesting to watch.
Yeah, to your point, to Stephanie's point, Trump loyalty has continued to define Republican primaries. I mean, you can just ask Jeff Sessions how that worked out. He obviously is the president's former attorney general, and the president endorsed his primary opponent in Alabama in that a top pickup opportunity for Republicans, for sure.
But we did see, Stephanie, remember, way back in June, remember June, how long ago that was? The beginning of June, the Trump campaign was saying Trump was whatever and like perfect record. And then along comes the Virginia 5th District convention, and the guy he endorsed, what happens?
Yeah. Well, some of the candidates that Trump has endorsed have lost. And back when Trump was touting that perfect record, a lot of the candidates that he was talking about who he'd endorsed who had won their primaries were candidates who were in pretty safe districts. Virginia's 5th was a weird one because of Virginia's political system. They didn't actually have an open primary where everybody could vote, or at least people in the party could vote. They did a convention, which was even more limited because of the restrictions on social gatherings during the coronavirus pandemic. So they had a very small pool of voters who were all, dedicated enough to the local political party that they went through the whole registration process and drove in some cases for hours to do this like weird drive-in convention that they did that day. But that in that case, the incumbent, who is kind of a libertarian, Denver Riggleman, he lost, even though he had Trump's endorsement. But that's kind of a weird district. But we did have some other candidates who had Trump's endorsement and have lost.
Yeah, but the kind of interesting thing, even in those cases where the president's preferred candidate lost, the candidate who beat the incumbent or the preferred candidate wasn't running against the president. They were just making the case that I'm the stronger ally of the president, even though the president has endorsed my opponent. So still you see that dynamic. It's not that folks are breaking with president and winning primaries. It's actually the opposite.
And it's also that in some cases, Trump made endorsements, but they're not all endorsements are created equal. I mean, he went all out for Tuberville, right? He did, he had him meet him at the plane when he landed in a neighboring state, and things like that. He really wanted Jeff Sessions to lose. In some of these other races, I don't know if he could pick Denver Riggleman out of a lineup, but so he endorsed these people, but when the even more stronger Trump supporter endorsed them, he sent out a tweet saying they're wonderful too, right? I mean, and then now we have these primaries in the most recent week. I mean, we have now QAnon support backers winning primaries, and he's endorsing them. I mean, where do you see that, ending up? Have we seen any impact that's already having?
Yeah, that was an interesting one because that candidate, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she won, excuse me, let me start that again. That candidate, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she was running in a more moderate district at the beginning of the cycle. She was supposed to be running against Lucy McBath in the suburban Atlanta district. But when Tom Graves retired in the 14th district, which is not even close to her home, but much more rural, she was encouraged to go ahead and run there, which she did. And she was in a race with a neurosurgeon who was also really trying to play up his Trump loyalty. She won the runoff, or she led the primary with a pretty high percentage of the vote, but made it to a runoff with this neurosurgeon. His name was John Cowan. And I don't think anybody nationally was really paying that much attention before that happened. She had the support of the House Freedom Fund, which is associated with the House Freedom Caucus, which was founded by White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. But once some of the stuff that she had said in videos started coming out, there was a lot of pressure on national Republicans to disavow her. She had said some pretty nasty things about Muslims, about Jewish people, about Black people. And she also is a QAnon supporter. And for people who aren't familiar with QAnon, it's an internet conspiracy that alleges that there's a big deep state cabal that's out to get Donald Trump, and it has some things to do with Satanism and pedophilia too. Once it looked like she was gonna win that seat, and because it's such a deep red seat, she would probably go to Congress. Some Republicans in Washington started saying that those kinds of things didn't represent their party, but nobody ever put any money behind it, and she still had the support of the House Freedom Fund, and she ended up winning her race on Tuesday night, and is probably going to Congress, and now all of a sudden she has Trump's support, and it's kind of a problem for Republicans in this cycle because they've really taken pains to point out the diversity of their recruits, but people like this are making it through their primaries.
Okay, let's talk about meddling, right? Didn't we have a couple of primaries where the two parties tried to meddle with the other guy's selection?
Yeah, we did see that in a couple of races, and that didn't really work out well for either party. But we still see in primaries, outside groups can play an influential role in some of these safe seats too, that Stephanie was kind of talking about, where whoever wins the primary is likely to come to Congress. If an outside group has a favorite candidate and they're willing to spend a lot of money on TV to bolster them, you can see that being pretty effective. We see groups like Club for Growth and Emily's List and other groups that have a lot of money behind them still doing that.
And then, of course, we had the outside money really trying to keep the people in the state of Kansas from nominating Chris Kobach for the Senate seat because they were afraid that he would doom their chances of holding on to that seat, which led to the DSCC trying to run an ad that says Chris Kobach is a Trump, clone, which is kind of an attack on him, but really isn't, because the Democrats wanted Chris Kobach to win. And then what about diversity. We talked a little about this coming into this cycle. One of the big issues Republicans recognized was, hey, we have a smaller caucus, and even smaller is the number of women we have in the House. They had 13, I believe, right now, and several of those are retiring. Where does that stand? Do they have any hope of increasing that?
Yeah, at this point, it's kind of unclear if Republican women are going to be able to grow their ranks in the House or the Senate. There are a number of Republican women who are retiring or in competitive races. And we have seen Republicans recruit women or more diverse candidates in a number of these competitive House races. But the thing about that is that they are obviously not guaranteed to come to Congress in November. They're looking at some really tough races. So to watch whether or not there will be a growth in the number of Republican women, it's important to also pay attention to the safe Republican seats that are open seats that have crowded primaries, and are women winning those races? And there's been sort of a mixed record on that. A few have won, a few have lost. So it's sort of, like I said, unclear at this point, but this is definitely something that Republican women in Congress are really concerned about.
And also another thing that we're seeing is that the districts where women tend to run are these more suburban districts. So you're seeing some races where you have multiple women running against each other in the primary. So it kind of they kind of cancel each other out.
Okay, let's talk about going forward. Do you think anything that happened in these primaries will have a lingering impact for either party going forward?
Well, I think certainly when we see incumbents lose and maybe some surprise losses, I would imagine it probably puts some incumbents on edge and maybe make some people wake up who haven't had a competitive race in a while. I'll be curious, just with the strength of, and Justice Democrats, this liberal group has been more willing to spend a lot of money in some of these primaries. It has a new super PAC arm. So I'm kind of curious if that moves the party, moves House Democrats in particular, to the left to try to fend off some of these primary challenges. And that's going to be something I think will be interesting to watch in the next Congress.
We already talked about Marjorie Greene a little bit, but I think it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how the Republican Party reacts to candidates like that as the QAnon theory becomes more mainstream, and as some parts of the party get pushed further to the right. And you're already seeing it come out a little bit in the presidential race after Kamala Harris was named as Joe Biden's running mate. Republicans were asked about whether attacks on her were rooted in racism or sexism, and they were asked on a call that I was on yesterday. Some people from the Trump team, Annalise Stefanik, who is a House member from upstate New York, were asked about Marjorie Greene and how they responded to that. And their response was, well, you can't, you have to hold Kamala Harris to a different standard because she's running on a national platform. You can't compare the two. You can't compare a Republican who's running for a House seat in Georgia to somebody who's running for vice president and who is a breath away from the president. But as more candidates, we're almost to the end of the primary season, but there are a couple more candidates coming up who have expressed some similar views. And as they have success and start to enter the mainstream, I don't know if that's going to be an adequate response anymore.
And one other dynamic that we saw play out in recent primaries that we haven't really touched on yet is with the protests around Black Lives Matter. We have seen Black candidates in particular be elevated in their primaries, winning some of these primaries in especially safer Democratic seats where they are likely to come to Congress. In the next Congress, we could see the first openly gay Black man, and also a Collective PAC, which is a group that backs Black candidates, pointed out recently that this could be the first time in the next Congress where the number of Black members of Congress is proportional to the population. And that is a really significant milestone as well. And it's been interesting. There's been so much chaos and uncertainty around all the primaries and all the protests layer on top of that. But we have seen that dynamic emerge. Interesting.
We also saw, I believe that, we're going back to the seats they flipped in 2018. I know, I you guys are sick of me talking about New Jersey because I spent most of my career covering that. But I saw a lot of liberals in North Jersey once they flipped seats like New Jersey 11, where Rodney Frelinghuysen was the congressman forever, thinking this is now a Democratic seat. And we should have a more liberal congressman or congresswoman than Mikey Sherrill, the Navy veteran who won it. But we really didn't see much of that, did we? That the moderate Democrats who flipped red seats got attacked from the left and taken out.
Right. And I will add the caveat there that in the competitive seats is sort of the key marker, because we did see Dan Lipinski, who's an Illinois Democrat, much more moderate. He's one of the few pro-life Democrats left in Congress. He lost his primary to a more liberal candidate. But you're right. In some of these really competitive seats that determine the majority, we didn't really see that kind of challenge from the left to a lot of these incumbents. And in some cases, I talked to one progressive strategist recently about this, who was making the case that we are more likely to win in these solid Democratic seats. We can make the case to push people further to the left there and really tap into the energy that's there, as opposed to risking a seat and then risking the majority.
Okay.
And I should add to, on the Republican side, we're not seeing incumbents losing their seats to challengers from their right so much. Although we've seen 4 Republican incumbents lose their seats to challengers. Those have been, one of them was to a QAnon supporter who owns a restaurant where everybody carries firearms. That was in Colorado. But
yeah, I will just clarify. She said she's not a QAnon follower, but she has kind of said some supportive things about it. Just to clarify. But yeah, you're right. That's a good point.
It's so hard to pin down.
Yeah.
But in those races, there were much more kind of traditional things at play. There were candidates who had scandals, like Steve Watkins in Kansas, who was accused or charged with voter fraud on the night of his debate, for example, or in that race in Colorado, the incumbent.
Awkward.
Yeah, really awkward. In Colorado, the incumbent Scott Tipton just also wasn't really running much of a campaign, so he wasn't really paying that much attention. And then there was Denver Riggleman, who just had that weird situation with his convention. And then Peter King, who we haven't really talked about, who Republicans have been trying to get rid of for a while. Steve King.
Peter King retired.
Sorry, wrong King. Bridget, you could talk about that because of
yeah, that was right. To Stephanie's point, in some of these sort of scandal plagued, or however you want to phrase it, Steve King had a history of racist and remarks and controversial remarks, and we did see Republicans kind of rally around his Republican primary challenger. The Main Street, a group affiliated with the Main Street Partnership, played in that race, and it was in part because King had a really close race in 2018 to a Democrat, even in this solidly Republican rural seat in Iowa. So it showed that he was really vulnerable and that there were voters that just weren't going to tolerate him anymore.
Okay, so we have a few more minutes. Stephanie, which primary surprised you the most?
Nothing surprises me, Herb.
Oh.
I predict it all. But one thing you mentioned, the Kansas Senate race. One thing that that was just an interesting race to watch the whole cycle, because there were just so many different plot twists thrown in. Republicans from the very beginning. Well, first of all, Kansas is just such a red state, and they've had a Republican senators there for such a long time that it's interesting that Republicans would be at all concerned about that seat. But it was pretty clear early on that they thought that if Chris Kobach was the nominee, that they had a chance of losing it. And that was partly because the Democratic nominee, Barbara Bollier, was considered such a strong recruit, and she's a former Republican. But it's also because Kobach, who has been a strong ally of President Trump, and was also heading his voter fraud task force for a while. He's all of a sudden, he's very popular in Kansas and very likely to win a primary, but all of a sudden he was considered a liability because he had lost the gubernatorial race in 2019 to a Democrat who was very similar to Barbara Bollier. And Republicans were very concerned that was going to happen again. So they were trying throughout the cycle to recruit Mike Pompeo, who's really popular in Kansas, and Pompeo flirted with it for a long time. So there were months and months of Willy Woney coverage until he finally just, he could drag it on for a long time because of when the Kansas filing deadlines were. But when it finally became clear that he wasn't going to do it, there was a real race in the Republican primary, and it just wasn't clear who was going to win. There was Roger Marshall, who is a House member and is also a doctor. Republicans were a little bit concerned about him because he had ousted a Tea Party member of Congress and had kind of ruffled some feathers when he came to the House originally. He's considered not as charismatic as Kobach. And then there was a plumber who had some like goofy ads and a lot of money who was in the race. And there were all questions about who was going to win and whether Roger Marshall was going to be able to pull together enough support, even though Republicans started to consolidate around him at the end, and he started to get a lot of outside support from Republicans. And then the Democrats jumped in, as you already mentioned, Herb, and started spending money to try to kind of boost Kobach's campaign. And even on the day of that election, nobody really knew how it was going to pan out, and everybody thought that it was going to be a really close race. I think the surprising thing there was that Marshall actually won with a pretty comfortable margin. And the thinking there was that you kind of saw that up and down the ballot in Kansas on primary day, that the more kind of establishment candidates actually did do pretty well against people who were more to the party's right. So that was interesting to see, and it's going to be an interesting race to watch. As you know, even though Marshall's win puts the seat a little bit less in play, it's still not anywhere near a given that they're going to be able to hold on to that seat this cycle. So it's still competitive.
And Bridget, your pick for most surprising?
Yeah, I think I'd have to say the Colorado's 3rd district race that we were talking about earlier, where Scott Tipton, the Republican, lost to a primary challenger named Lauren Boebert. And that was just one of the biggest surprises. Nobody saw that coming. There are usually some indications if an incumbent has a primary, there's some kind of signs that they might be in trouble. Either there's an outside group weighing in and bolstering the challenger, or the incumbent's getting outraised or outspent. And that wasn't the case in this race. She just kind of came out of nowhere. She did spend on television, and Tipton didn't. It didn't seem like, from folks I talked to in Colorado, it didn't seem like he was taking that race very seriously. But it was a surprising primary result. And then the next day, spent all day talking to Republicans in Colorado, trying to figure out what happened here. And one of the interesting points that maybe tells a broader story about the election is that the Republican primary in Colorado saw significantly high turnout, higher than in other recent primaries, which is notable because there wasn't anything that interesting happening higher up the ticket. Like Democrats in Colorado had a Senate primary going on. There's tons of money pouring into the state, so that might have been pulling Democrats out. But there wasn't the similar thing happening on the Republican side. And there are kind of mixed theories and folks that I talked to in Colorado about why that was. You know, what is there some sort of anti-incumbent wave coming? And there's some disagreement on that, but I remember talking to one strategist who said, you know, people are stuck at home and they are upset and angry about everything going on, and Colorado is an all vote by mail state, and their ballots are right there, so people are voting. And I just keep thinking about that in terms of looking to November, like what is that going to mean for turnout and for incumbents that might be in trouble? And, you know, are people just going to be angry and really mobilized? And we're going to have to obviously wait to see what that looks like. But that was just, yeah, that was quite a surprise.
Yeah, I have a feeling the whole business of get your ballot in by postmarked by election day is going to be less of an issue because everybody's going to be mailing in their ballots the minute they get them. I just don't think really people are waiting until election day to say, oh, I've got to drop off my ballot. Anyway, I'm going to ask now for our tech wizards to let Nathan Gonzalez out of his soundproof booth. And okay, so we're back. I'm not sure where I cut you off, but I didn't listen to instructions as usual. So we've got one question here. It's on the Montana Senate race. Who wants to know, what we think of the race between Senator Steve Daines and Governor Steve Bullock. Nathan, you want to give us your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think this is one of the most competitive Senate races in the country. It's not one that we expected to be competitive. President Trump won Montana by 20 points. And for much of the cycle, Democrats didn't have a top tier recruit, but getting Governor Steve Bullock, he dropped out of the presidential race. Then there was a little bit of a lag and he jumped into the Senate race, was a true game changer. And that puts Democrats, it gives Democrats a legitimate opportunity where they didn't previously have one. It'll be fascinating. The presidential race right now, I've mentioned Trump winning it by 20. It looks like it's a low to mid single digit race. So the presidential race is competitive. And Bullock is the only sitting governor running for the Senate right now, which might be a blessing or a curse when it comes to the coronavirus, because he is the public face of the coronavirus response. And if he handles it well, he has an opportunity to kind of move beyond just being a Senate candidate. If he doesn't handle it well, then that could hurt his Senate chances. But we have that in our toss-up category, and that's certainly one of the races to watch.
That's an interesting dynamic, because Stephanie, you wrote about that just today, in today's newsletter about Florida 26, where the mayor of Miami-Dade County is also in a primary, right?
Yeah, that's that's the only other race where we're seeing somebody who's an elected official who's in a position to make decisions about protecting his community during the pandemic is on the ballot. Their Republicans think that it's going to be a strength for him, partly because he has a very long background as a first responder. He was a fire chief for a long time before he went into politics, and he has a pretty good reputation in the area. But Democrats don't see it that way at all, and it's in Miami-Dade County, which has been a hot spot, and it seems like cases there are still growing. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch. That's one that Republicans actually, one of the few seats that we're seeing in the House that's held by a Democratic incumbent that Republicans think that they can flip this cycle.
So we also have a question on the North Carolina 11. This is the district that was previously represented by Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff. You had a guy who was 24 years old, he's now 25, Madison Cawthorn, win the primary. But a lot of interesting things have come out about him this week. Nathan, have you followed any of those? Because I know the reporter who's on that race for us is not on this program. But one of the questions asked, what do you think about the impact of him doing Instagram photos from Hitler's vacation residence and some other incidents that candidates usually don't try to do?
Yeah, well, for a race that is largely was supposed to be considered over once the primary was over, it certainly piqued some new interest in it. A couple of things stick out. I mean, a lot of the news is relatively new within the last few days, but Democrats subsequently have released a couple of polls showing that the presidential race in the district is close and that the congressional race is close. And what's interesting, Democrats released those after the news came out. Those polls were conducted before, and that is evidence that Democrats are looking far and wide for opportunities. We've known what the first 40, 50 competitive House races are, but as we've seen the president standing diminish, or he's struggling to recapture that 2016 magic, Democrats are looking at a lot of different races that I'm sure they weren't planning on looking at. And this district in North Carolina is one of them. Mo Davis, the Democratic nominee, hasn't been one of those stellar fundraisers, but this will spark some interest. I'm sure some donors from around the country are suddenly plugged into this race, and it's one that we have our ratings, but we also started a races to watch, and this is creeping closer to that race. We have to definitely pay attention to it.
And one other thing to note too about North Carolina is that it has a very competitive Senate race, and it's a presidential battleground, and there are a couple of competitive House races as well. So there's going to be a lot of money and a lot of attention on the state that might have implications kind of up and down the ballot.
And the congressional districts, this is the first time the election is going to be run in a new set of congressional districts that after the last set were thrown out by a court as gerrymandering.
Right.
So Bridget, this is probably your question. Somebody asks, are the Justice Democrats really helping people when they go after committee chairmen and subcommittee chairmen and replace them with backbenchers, quote, who can't get anything done? I wonder if this questioner really has an open mind on the question, but do you think it has, any impact in the House Democratic caucus that they think they have to look over their shoulders at one of their colleagues coming at them?
I think it does. And I think to kind of get to the question itself, certainly the committee chairs would say this hurts the district that you don't have someone who is so influential anymore in power. But what you hear the message from these primary challengers from, for example, Jamal Bowman in New York City and from Ocasio-Cortez, I covered her primary in 2018, is their response to that is, well, what good has this power done? When Ocasio-Cortez beat Joe Crowley, he was one of the top Democrats in the House. And I remember talking to her, and she was saying that it came up at one of the meetings that she was at, that she was asked, like, he might be the next speaker. Like, what good is it for us to lose somebody like that? And her response was, it hasn't really helped us to have someone with that power. Of course, the lawmakers and Congressman Crowley would disagree with that. But that's sort of how the primary challengers are approaching it. And I think what's interesting that Ocasio-Cortez and the other members of the so-called squad have shown is that even as backbencher freshmen, you can be an influential voice. Now with social media, you can have your own following. And she's going to be able to speak now at the Democratic convention next week, which is pretty remarkable for a first-term congresswoman. So you can still, it is interesting though to kind of see those different power dynamics. And it doesn't seem like at least primary voters aren't always valuing the seniority aspect of that.
Okay. And Stephanie, I know you had to step in on the Minnesota primary last week because our colleague Kate was on vacation. There's a question just about the Colin Peterson race in Minnesota 7. You guys were also in on all the calls for the most vulnerable list, and I trying to remember, we moved Peterson off the list, right?
Yeah, he dropped off, which is kind of interesting and maybe raise a few eyebrows because the president carried that district by, I think, 30 points. So theoretically he should be on, but sorry to hop in, but Stephanie, you can jump in too. But he did come off of our most vulnerable list.
Well, what was the question? First of all, you just said there was a
just
question.
What they want to hear about Minnesota 7.
Sure. Colin Peterson is an interesting member. He's kind of an artifact of an earlier time in Congress. We did have
unicorn is a word that has come up quite a bit when we've talked about Colin Peterson.
Yeah, he's a Democrat in a pretty conservative district, and he's been able to stay there for a very long time, partly because he does really take a center line on a lot of issues. He was one of the only Democrats in the House, along with Jeff Van Drew, to vote against the impeachment inquiry, for example, and that's something that's worked out for him. I know, Bridget, you've covered that race longer than I have. Is there anything else that you would want to say about it?
Yeah, I would just say that I think Republicans are still feeling confident that he's going to be in some trouble because of the recruit, the Republican nominee is Michelle Fischbach, and she's been fundraising pretty well. And Peterson had a fairly close race in 2018 against an opponent who hadn't raised a lot. So that was a sign that he could be vulnerable. But, even if so like Nathan was mentioning earlier, where we're seeing the president's numbers drop across the country, if he wins this district by 15 points instead of 30 points, does that give Peterson a window to kind of to come through there? But yeah, I think the kind of interesting thing, and Nathan, I know you've written about Minnesota's second district too, but Minnesota sort of exemplifies where both parties are making gains. Like in 2018, they lost some of these rural seats that had long been Democratic territory, but then we're shifting towards the president. But then we're winning seats in suburban areas that have been held by Republicans. And I know you wrote about the second district recently and digging into that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Minnesota was one of the closest races at the presidential level in 2016, and now it's not really in the serious conversation about the presidential races. And part of that is because of the president continues to suffer in the suburbs, which second district, where it's now Angie Craig, where Jason Lewis lost, the third district, which Congressman Eric Paulson, the Republican, lost in 2018. I mean, the president is just getting crushed in those districts. But Colin Peterson, the seventh district, is fascinating to me because when you talk to strategists on both sides, on most races, you kind of get an agreement on what's happening. It might be off by a few points. And right now in Minnesota 7, you have Republicans, Congressional Leadership Fund, the big Republican outside group that focuses on House races, released a poll where Fishbach is up big. I think Democrats believe that Colin Peterson is in fine shape right now. So we're kind of treading. You have one party polling Venus and one party polling Mars right now, and it's a little bit. We'll see. In a few weeks, we're going to know who's right.
The other thing you might want to consider is that unlike, Elliot Engel, who's the Foreign Affairs Chairman in New York City and in the suburbs, being chairman of the House Agriculture Committee in Minnesota 7 is for Colin Peterson is probably important to his constituents. I'm not sure how many people in Elliot Engel's district were that a concern with him being chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So we're at about 3:45, and this is the point where I have to say thank you to Stephanie and Bridget, and please read all their stories on rollcall.com. And then we're going to be back in 1 second, and Nathan is going to take us through his look on the big picture.
Two.
Okay, Nathan. So you and I both put ties on today. That's probably a first for me, I know, since March.
This is what I wear on Thursdays, Herb. This is Thursday. This is
okay.
what I wear every day.
Let's talk with your ratings right now on Trump versus Biden. How do you see the Electoral College working?
I mean, I think Joe Biden has a distinct advantage right now. You can see all the ratings, House, Senate, presidential. If you go to rollcall.com/election-guide. But according to our ratings right now, we have Joe Biden with 319 electoral votes, President Trump with 187, 270 are needed to win. And I get it. Anytime we talk about what we think is happening now, the discussion goes to 2016 and say, well, everyone was wrong. And I think 2016 should have brought a level of humility and humbleness to this election projection, but I also don't think we should ignore the data. And right now, there's almost universal agreement that the data is pointing in one direction. And if I could circle back to what we were talking about earlier, we are seeing President Trump underperforming his own 2016 performance by about 8 to 10 points or more. And that is creating problems. That is shifting the initial battleground of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. That's kind of shifted them to Biden. But on that other end of what we thought were the solid Republican districts or states, it's making them more competitive. We're talking seriously about Texas and Georgia, and Montana is closer than we thought it was going to be. So that's where we see it today. I feel like we would be a disservice to our readers and the people that are watching to say, oh, it's a toss-up, we don't know. I think this is what the data are showing, realizing that the other outcome could happen, but right now, President Trump has to be considered the underdog.
And what about the conventions in the next 2 weeks? Do you see them, I should say conventions,
Right.
do you see them changing the picture? Do we see anybody getting a Trump bounce because his convention is second?
I'm skeptical, and that's not because I'm anti-convention. I actually wish, that it was safe to go to the conventions. It's something that I enjoy going to every 4 years, but I'm just, most things, we have such a polarized environment, and the president is so polarizing that most news events don't impact the voters' minds all that much. I mean, I would argue impeachment really didn't impact voters' minds all that much. What did kind of shift the trajectory of a race from a fairly even and competitive race to one that the president is an underdog was the president's response to a global pandemic, and the president's response to a maybe a once in a generation conversation about racism in America. I mean, that's what it took to really change the trajectory of this election. And so the conventions, maybe somebody's going to make a big mistake, but now because they're all virtual, they should be, very produced, very practiced, and there shouldn't be a lot of surprises. So I think we're going to have, if the trajectory of the race changes, it probably won't be because of the conventions. It'll be because of some other exterior news event.
Okay. What about the Senate? So the Democrats need a net 4 seats or 3 if Kamala Harris becomes Senate president as vice president. Are they going to get them?
Our current projection is a Democratic gain of 3 to 5 Senate seats, a net gain of 3 to 5 Senate seats. And because I just said that I thought that Joe Biden has the advantage, then 3 is that threshold. So right now our projection is that Democrats are more likely than not to gain control. But there are a handful of Senate races that are close, that are within a few points, still tens of millions of dollars left to be spent. And if the president can improve his standing by 3, 4, 5 points, then that makes those Iowas and Texas and Georgias, maybe Kansas, it makes them more difficult for Democrats. But right now, the president, he might have bottomed out. I don't think we really see evidence that he has started that climb. And you mentioned something in the beginning segment about how the window to rebound is much smaller, or there's less of an opening than it's not till November 3rd. The president and Republicans don't have until November 3rd to kind of change course, because voters are going to start getting ballots in September. Some voters are going to get ballots in September. They're going to be voting in September and October. So you can't wait to peak until November 3rd. They have to start this, start their climb much sooner.
Okay. And the House, we had the Republicans telling us just wait till 2020. But now on our list, the top 10 House most vulnerable, 5 of them are Republicans. You've moved a bunch of people in the last, was a week ago Friday. Was it just last Friday? It was just last Friday.
It's all running together, Herb. If you told me it was May, I'd probably believe you.
Yeah. But what do you see in the House?
Well, in the House, a lot of the Republican confidence coming into 2020 from 2018 is that the president was going to be on the ballot, turn out Republicans who didn't come out when he wasn't on the ballot, and an expectation that he would perform, President Trump would do at least as good as he did in 2016. And that just isn't how it's played out so far. In 2016, I crunched the numbers. I think President Trump finished ahead of Hillary Clinton in 226 congressional districts. Now that's more than the 218 that's needed for a majority. So if he were able to get to his 2016 margin or totals, that would be good news. But he, again, take 8 to 10 points off of that performance, and he's probably closer to carrying maybe 180 congressional districts, and that is a heavy lift for Republican challengers in dozens of districts to overperform the president, particularly when Democratic incumbents are almost all very well financed, and they're going to have millions of dollars to make their own case. So I think it's more likely right now that Democrats gain seats or increase their majority than it is Republicans get the majority back.
Okay, and we've gotten a few questions here. And I always love that people use district numbers, and you know what they are. I don't. But do you believe
See,
a
this is the
Democrat?
live pop quiz.
This is it. Do you believe a Democrat could win Texas 23? And I will reach for my guide to see which district that is now.
Again, rollcall.com/election is Texas 23rd. This is where Republican Congressman Will Hurd is not seeking reelection.
Okay.
Will Hurd was one of the 3 Republicans who won reelection in 2018 in a district that Hillary Clinton carried. So his exit, he was regarded as one of Republicans' top incumbents, strongest incumbents. And so his exit leaves a void. And because of that and that district dynamic, we have Democrats having the advantage. Gina Ortiz-Jones, who lost a close race in 2018, is running again on the Democratic side. Tony Gonzalez on the Republican side, and we have Democrats with the advantage with that sort of national and local atmosphere. But this district always hosts very close races. It's difficult to pull. They're very rural. Large Hispanic population, and so I expect it to be close, but I also expect Democrats to prevail.
And in Iowa 4, we talked about Steve King before. I believe we got a quote from you when Steve King lost that this makes it more likely the Republicans are going to hold the district, right? Do you think J.D. Scholten's got a chance?
I mean, he has a chance. And that might give nightmares to Republicans who play in the congressional baseball game, because J.D. Scholten is both simultaneously running for Congress and trying to get his fastball up to 86 miles per hour. He didn't make it to the major leagues, but a former professional baseball player. It's decidedly more difficult for Scholten against Randy Feenstra, who defeated Steve King in the primary. I expect the president, right now it looks like the president could lose in the first, second, and third districts, which all have two Democratic incumbents and one Democratic open seat. But the fourth, under almost all circumstances, will elect a Republican. Steve King tested how close you can get by almost losing in 2018. Now that it's Feenstra, we're watching it, but I expect Feenstra to win over Scholten.
Okay. And Ohio 10, is Timms really a viable candidate?
They're trying to give you as little information, Herb, as
Yeah,
possible.
I know. And I just get to ask them too.
So Ohio 10, this is actually a race we just added to our list. Republican Congressman Mike Turner from the Dayton area, and Desiree Timms, the Democratic nominee. Not a district that we've really paid attention to in a long time, but Congressman Turner's recent fundraising has not been good. Ohio wasn't previously a presidential battleground, at least earlier in the cycle. Now it is. The president has slipped considerably, and this is a district that he won, but not by the 30 points that we were talking about in Minnesota 7. And so kind of a combination of uncertainty at the top of the ticket, maybe a congressman who is not taking the seat. He hasn't had a real test in a long time. It's one worth watching, particularly if the president doesn't rebound.
Okay. And an interesting question, do your predictions, how do you take into account voter suppression or the ability to vote in different states when you figure out whether a race is competitive or how competitive it is?
We're getting close to the end, Herb, and I don't want to end on a depressing note. So hopefully we have another question.
Well, you gave me the walkout question. It's right here on my piece of paper. You know that.
I think there is legitimate concern about all ballots being counted in this election. I mean, just look at the news that we're seeing about the Postal Service and what it's able to do and how much money it has. And I've been saying for this whole cycle, I expect there to be record turnout because both parties are very excited to send a message either for or against the president. And I'm going to stick to that prediction that we're going to have a record number of, set a modern day record for people who want to vote, who cast a ballot. Now, whether those are counted or not, and maybe it's not just a Postal Service issue. In some of these primary elections, some mail-in ballots were cast aside because they didn't come in time, signature matches, whatever it might be. So I'm I'm trying to be both optimistic and prepare for chaos and a mess. There's going to be litigation about what ballots are counted. And to come back to the initial question, it's tough to account for that because it's sort of arbitrary in saying, okay, we're going to take 1% off of this party or 2% off or 3%. There's not a lot of specific ways to quantify that potential challenge.
Okay, and we're in our last minute. So what do we see that's happening now that's going to have an impact on the parties going forward in future years?
That's good. We have 2020 figured out, so I like looking ahead.
Yeah.
I think an important lesson important thing to watch when these elections are finally done is listen to the politicians and how they talk about the election. Because the lessons that what happens in the election doesn't matter as much as what the politicians think happened in the election.
Values voters.
What was that?
Values voters. We all have to listen to what.
For example, let's say that if Joe Biden indeed wins, Democrats take control of the Senate, they expand the majority in the House, there are going to be Democrats who say, we have a mandate. Voters have given us a mandate to do and implement all the policies we've been talking about. And I really don't think that's necessarily going to be the message coming out of the election if they win. It will be that enough voters were tired of President Trump and tired of the Republican Party answering for him. But if Democrats, if they learn a different lesson, that's going to drive their behavior and impact their legislative agenda in the next Congress. That also they could risk a backlash in voters in 2022 who say, no, we didn't want you to do all those things. We need to get some Republicans in to keep an eye on these Democrats. And for Republicans, under this scenario, what lessons do they learn from a potential President Trump loss? Because it could really go one of two ways, or at least one of two ways. They could say, look, President Trump and his style and his policies really torpedoed the party in the suburbs, and we got to go a different direction. Or they could say, you know what, this was a fraudulent election. There was meddling by foreign, it was mail-in balloting was a disaster, and they could blame it on other things and really not have any sort of course correction as a party. So listen, I want you to listen to us, always read roll call, but listen to the politicians, because that's gonna drive behavior.
Okay. All right. Well, we're over time and we don't want to have to, go to Zoom jail. So I want to thank you, Nathan, and thanks to Bridget and Stephanie, wherever you went to. Hopefully you're writing your stories for the weekend now. And thank all of you for watching and listening, and keep reading our show.